So it is time to thin my fruit trees, and I've got apples and pears back here. And some varieties of these apples or pears will have clusters, and a lot of the fruit in the cluster will end up setting. And so you need to go through and thin them out. And some people are like, oh no, that's unnecessary. You don't need to do that because the trees do go through what's called the June drop, at least apples do. I don't know about pears, where they sort of thin out the fruit themselves selectively. And on this variety, there's maybe like with each cluster, like 2 of the fruit or the flowers will sort of abort and drop off the cluster. But sometimes you get a cluster that, has 6 or 7 apples forming on it. And so having that many fruits close together is just what you end up doing is the plant will distribute its energy evenly among those, or almost evenly among those, and so you end up with a bunch of smaller fruit. And the other problem with leaving all of the fruit on is that the little gap between the fruit, or actually it ends up that the fruit are touching each other, and that is like the perfect place for bugs and other pests of apples to make their homes. And so I was just thinning out some fruit right over there, and there was a worm that had made a web between about 3 different fruit, and I clipped them off, and at least 2 of the fruit had this big gouge taken out of them. So that's another reason to thin your fruit, because you want airflow and you want open air around your fruit. And the airflow will keep down the disease, and then having no fruits touching each other will mean there's no space in there for a little bug to make its home and start eating the fruit out. The other reason that you want to thin out the fruit is because the tree will distribute energy and disperse it among all the fruit that it has. So if it has 300 fruit, it's going to send out its its energy to all of those fruit, versus if you have 50 fruit, it's going to send out the same amount of energy to those 50 fruit. You're going to end up with much bigger fruit, especially if you just leave 1 fruit per cluster on the tree, and then that one will get all of the energy going to that branch, and so you'll end up with this larger fruit, which in my mind is much better than having a bunch of small, gnarly, insect-ridden fruit. And that's what I've found is the result of doing this thinning, is that I end up with these big, much more of them are beautiful looking fruit. So this is a good example. This cluster has 3 fruits on it, so I'm going to just leave the one in the middle, which is the king bud fruit. The other thing about going through and thinning like this is, right now a lot of these fruit have already been gotten to by the Plum Curculio, and so they will leave a crescent-shaped cut in any fruit that they've laid their eggs in. And so as you go through, you're kind of looking at the fruit, and the ones that have that crescent-shaped cut in, you're gonna thin those ones out and leave the prettier looking fruit behind. So this is a good example right here of a Plum Curculio incision there. It just slices through the fruit skin and lays its eggs in there. And the Curculio is kind of like a little beetle that has a snout on it, and that snout, I think, is what it uses to slice through the skin and lay its eggs. Well, and then it probably turns around and lays its eggs with the other end. You can see that this pear tree here has a lot of fruit on it. It's going to need a lot of thinning. Taking out the smaller ones and the ones clearly that have a insect issue. That one just came right off. They're already starting to kind of thin themselves. And as far as what is the best time to thin your fruit, usually I wait until the fruit is about an inch in diameter, maybe a little bit less than an inch in diameter. You don't want to wait until it's much bigger than that, because then the tree will be putting energy into all that fruit, and then if you snip it off, you're kind of wasting all that energy. But then if you do it too early, you also don't know which fruit the tree is going to abort anyways. It will usually put its energy into the one that's left. So if you cut a bunch of them out and just leave one left, it's probably less likely to drop that fruit. But it tends to drop the less developed ones and leave the one that's the first to bloom and the biggest. So that's kind of the logic that I'm using in thinning, and I think the tree uses the same logic. In the interest of science, I'm going to leave one of these branches, or maybe a couple of them, and not thin the fruit at all, and just see later in the season. We'll see what the difference is. We'll see if the tree dropped more fruit and we ended up with just about the same thing, in which case we'll have determined that I don't need to be doing this. We'll also be able to see if the fruit seem to have a lot more pest pressure and damage from pests, and then we'll also find out if they're bigger. So it might seem like a lot of wasted fruit, but really I'll probably, in terms of the amount of fruit and the weight of fruit, I would get about the same. It's just the fruit will be bigger and prettier. And a huge factor in growing apples that don't have damage on them is being able to store them, because if they even have like one worm going through them, they'll rot before they can be stored very long. So you kind of have to have a really perfect apple in order to store it well. And now, since a lot of these thinned apples and pears have the curculio eggs in them and potentially other eggs and bugs in them, I'm going to just submerge these in water to kill anything that might be in there. You can also just burn them or cut them up and otherwise dispose of them in a way that destroys the eggs and the bugs that might be in them, because if you just let them fall on the ground around the tree, it's possible that those bugs will just end up in the ground. You can see though how these apples have grown quite a bit, and since I've thinned them, they're bigger than they otherwise would be. There's a couple of clusters that I didn't get to or missed that are up higher, and you can see that the apples are smaller. And then I've got these fruit trees back here, 2 apple trees and a pear. And you can see this pear is just loaded with fruit. And way up there on the higher branches, those are the ones that I didn't thin. And you can see the difference in size between those pears and these ones down here. By and large, like the lower ones are bigger. But I still think this tree is pretty overloaded. And pears don't tend to drop fruit like apple trees do. Apples seem to have this habit of dropping fruit. But pears keep all their fruit, and so if you don't thin them, they're going to overload. All of these are absolutely perfectly shaped. Very little insect damage. Curculio. Don't forget to subscribe to Hardcore Sustainable and click on the bell to get notifications. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Also, follow us on Instagram and Facebook for additional non-video posts. And we'll see you next time.